Australia's most distinct feature is its isolation. It's a country, a nation, and a continent all in one. Its location and wealth gives the impression that the country is secure and prosperous. Yet, the circumstances the country finds itself in portray an entirely different picture. In this analysis, we will go over the modern geopolitical challenges of Australia. My name is Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. For more information on the show, please visit our Facebook page in the description. Most of Australia's population is concentrated in the southeast of the country. Roughly 80% of the total population lives in urban areas, and almost half of the nation lives in the three largest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. This forms the heartland of Australia, and it's this vast concentration of people that determines the national policy of the country. The capital, Canberra, is located further in the interior near the Murray-Darling River system, which in turn is located in the Murray-Darling Basin. This fertile geographic area forms the agricultural center of Australia. In between the agricultural center and the population heartland lies the Great Dividing Range, which runs the entire length of the eastern coastline. Further east lies Australia's interior, known as the Outback. This is a vast and remote place with an arid climate. Here, large-scale human habitation is nearly impossible, yet it is in the Outback where Australia's iron and coal reserves are located. These primary commodities and the mining industry in general form a crucial part of the country's economic system. As an island, Australia is surrounded by about 8,200 smaller islands. Neighboring New Zealand on its own poses no threat to Australia due to the lack of resources. In fact, New Zealand will find itself in the same geopolitical position as Australia. The islands of Java, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, located north, mostly serve as a buffer zone for Australia. The isolated geographic layout with a northern buffer zone makes any military action against Australia extremely costly. Even if a major power somehow managed to occupy the neighboring islands and build up forces in those locations, the invading forces would find themselves in northern Australia, which is almost 2,000 kilometers from the heartland. So unless the invading forces march through a long distance composed of poor and non-existing roads, the seizing of northern regions will be meaningless. And if the occupying force does decide to push south to the heartland, maintaining those long-distance supply lines in war times would be nearly impossible. All in all, in military terms, Australia is just too far away. In fact, it may well be considered one of the most secure countries in the world. Yet, despite its secure location, Australia has spent much of its history engaged in warfare. The nation has fought in a number of military confrontations, including the Second Boer War, World War I, World War II, and the wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Only during World War II was the security of Australia at stake. To explain this phenomenon, we must first clarify the modern circumstances of the country. With a GDP of $1.4 trillion, Australia's economy ranks 19th in the world. Almost 70% of the nation's labor force is active in the services sector. The country's annual exports and imports stand at roughly $180 and $200 billion respectively. But here's the thing, almost half of its exports are minerals such as coal, iron, gold, and more. Most of these resources are headed to China, Japan, and South Korea. This reality shows that Australia lacks any kind of self-sufficiency, meaning the country's high standard of living is completely dependent on international trade. Dependency on maritime trade is a typical characterization of an island nation. However, in Canberra's case, it's slightly more complicated. Australia exports mostly low-cost per kilo exports, such as coal and iron. However, it has to utilize more ships relative to value in order to export to the Asian countries. In other words, a cargo vessel with 500,000 tons of coal is less cost-effective than a vessel with 500,000 tons of luxury commodities. This means that Australia has to use more vessels to remain competitive in the world markets for its exports. What's more is that since all its trade goes by sea, Canberra is fully dependent on maritime trading routes. The largest of these routes passes through eastern Australia and splits in two. The first route passes between Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and heads for the ports of Japan. The second passes through the Indonesian Lombok Strait and heads for the port of China. There are other routes that connect Australia to the United States and the European continent, and there is a major trading route that passes through the Indian Ocean. All in all, safeguarding all of this traffic is beyond the capabilities of the Australian Navy. Instead, that task falls to the leading maritime power. Historically, Australia allied itself with the dominating maritime power to protect its trade. First, it was the British Empire, and more recently it has been the United States. As part of the understanding, Australia participated in the British and American wars in order to receive security guarantees. We went over these historic developments in a previous Caspian report. The alliance with the United States worked for a while, but following the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, China was no longer considered a long-term security threat. As a result, Australian-Chinese trade increased. East Asia became the new primary export destination for Australian goods. Along with a new market destination, the economy grew and the standard of living increased. For a while, it seemed like a win-win situation for everyone. However, the recent escalation in the South China Sea puts Canberra between a rock and a hard place. Australia depends on China for a large portion of its trade. At the same time, Canberra depends on Washington for its security. Any kind of confrontation between a major trading partner and a major security partner will have dreadful consequences for Australia. In such a scenario, the American Navy would blockade China's ports. Beijing recognizes a naval blockade as its single greatest threat, whilst Washington sees the blockade as its most effective leverage. Neither side is even remotely close to such a confrontation, but geopolitics is based on capabilities and not on intentions. Things can change quickly. Either way, a conflict of interest sits at the core of Australia's foreign policy. A showdown between China and the United States would have tremendous consequences for Australia. As trade would fall, the standard of living would decline. This in turn would tear the social fabric of the Australian society. When push comes to shove, Australia will choose the greater maritime power, which in this case is the United States. However, if somehow Beijing manages to rise as a regional naval power capable of challenging Washington, then, in theory, Australia could shift its geopolitical stance and ally itself with China. After all, nations do not have permanent friends, only permanent interests. With a little nudge by state propaganda, cultural affinity and sentiment can be shifted towards any means. However, a Chinese navy capable of challenging the American Navy is unlikely to occur in the foreseeable future. Historically and currently, no major country wants to harm or conquer Australia. The most realistic threat to Canberra is that a major power, in this case either China or the United States, in pursuit of their respective interests, act in such a manner that it unintentionally harms Australia. And in geopolitics, this happens all too often. Indonesia is somewhat of an exception to the geographic isolation of Australia. A stable and centralized Indonesia, as it was during the rule of Sukarno and Suharto, will focus outwards and aim to establish a regional sphere of influence. Yet, at the same time, an unstable and decentralized Indonesia offers opportunities to jihadists or communist militant forces to block the regional straits. The hostile forces wouldn't even need to form a naval blockade. The security of straits depends as much on land as it does on water. For example, if an Al-Qaeda affiliated group with the right equipment would find a way to stimulate piracy in the Indonesian straits, then suddenly instability in Indonesia becomes a major security concern for Australia as it disrupts the maritime traffic. Piracy may seem like a thing of the past, but in the past few years, we've seen the rise of piracy at the Horn of Africa. A multinational task force has been deployed in the region to combat piracy, and the task force has been somewhat successful, but the endeavor has substantially raised the costs of insurances for naval vessels. Piracy in the Horn of Africa could inspire similar groups in the passages and straits along Java, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. All it takes is political instability in Indonesia or the sponsorship of piracy by a major power. What's more is that piracy in this region would involve far more sophisticated equipment and tactics than seen in the Horn of Africa. Think of artillery, naval mines, and even first-generation anti-ship cruise missiles that small militant groups can use. This potential piracy crisis in the straits and passages along the region of New Java, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands would easily shut down the local maritime traffic. Prior to 9/11, piracy or militancy in the Indonesian Straits was considered unthinkable. However, after the September 11 attacks, Canberra reformulated its strategy. Preventing piracy and militancy in the Indonesian Straits is now a top priority for the Australian leadership. However, Australia's willingness to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan turned the country and its nationals into targets for terrorist organizations. The 2002 Bali bombings, which cost the lives of 88 Australians, is an example of the blowback that Australia is experiencing. Thus, the attempts to eliminate jihadist threats in the Indonesian Straits have resulted in terrorist attacks targeting Australian citizens abroad. This threat will continue in the foreseeable future. Still, terrorism alone is not a threat to the national security of Australia. Ultimately, Australia's national interests come down to the following objectives. First, the country needs to protect its maritime trade, especially the trade passing through Java, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. This objective is beyond the control of Australia. The only way it can be secured is through an alliance with the United States. However, an alliance with the United States is not enough, and this forms the second objective. Canberra needs to make Washington aware of Australian interests when dealing with regional issues. This is rather hard to accomplish. In order to extract security guarantees from the United States, Canberra must offer or withdraw something that can shape the behavior of Washington. Thus far, Australia has managed this by participating in American wars. Next is the third objective. Somehow, Australia needs to maintain a dormant yet stable Indonesia. Canberra has no options to influence events in Jakarta. Instead, both countries can cooperate in joint counter-terrorist missions. The final objective is for Canberra to diversify its trading partners and reduce its dependency on exports. This objective is a long-term strategy, and it will allow the country to develop a more self-sufficient economy. However, the issue with this objective is that politicians are unlikely to step out their comfort zones. Maintaining an alliance with Washington is easier than reshaping the economic system. Overall, the strength and weaknesses of Australia is its location. The country cannot secure its interests and thus must seek a partner that can. The price for this strategic alliance means that Australia must send its soldiers to faraway locations to fight in the partners' wars. In essence, Australia appears to be secure, wealthy, and prosperous, yet in reality, the country is trapped by geopolitics and its sovereignty is subject to outside forces. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Special thanks to the following people on Patreon for their contributions, and if you want to help with the costs of the show, please visit our Patreon page in the description. For now, thank you for watching, take care, and Sahol.